Hello and welcome to part 3 of my grown-up book report for my Intro to Social Media Marketing class. And again, the book we're discussing is Gary Vaynerchuk's Jab, 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 Right Hook. In this final section of the book report, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on some of the observations that Gary made about each of the social media platforms in depth and what kind of content works on which platform. He gets into a lot of detail here. The chapters are very long, and he does these really fascinating color commentaries at the end of each chapter in which he looks at real-world examples of jabs and hooks, and he talks about whether he finds them successful or unsuccessful. So what I've done for this book report, and I'm going to link to it in the description below, is I've created some Pinterest boards for 4 of the platforms, for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. And I searched for different jabs and hooks on those platforms, did screenshots, and shared them on Pinterest with my thoughts. So it's my own color commentary in the style of Gary's, a little bit in the style of Gary's, that applies the rules that he sets out in the book to stuff that I found while researching online. One caveat, Gary does talk about Tumblr as well in the book, but I've left off Tumblr from my Pinterest board for a couple of reasons. One is because it's a very GIF-heavy social media platform that doesn't translate as well to Pinterest board, but also the main reason is that I am very unfamiliar with Tumblr. I did a little bit of research on it while I was reading this book, but I didn't feel I could properly identify successful jabs versus unsuccessful jabs, and it's something I'm gonna delve more deeply into in the future. Now, because there is an overwhelming amount of information, all of it fabulous, in the book about each of the platforms, I'm not going to talk about it all here. But I thought I would share my favorite piece of information from each chapter on each social media platform. So the first up is Facebook. And the thing that I found really fascinating about the Facebook chapter was the bit on sponsored stories. Now, obviously, I have seen lots of things on my feed about sponsored stories, and we talked about it during our Facebook class. But Gary gave me some information that I was unaware of. I didn't realize that you could pay for sponsored stories not only to show up in the news feeds of more of your followers, but also to highlight engagement to friends of fans who engage with your content. So if you are The Gap, for example, and you create a sponsored story about a clothing sale, and one of your fans interacts with that sponsored story, say posts a comment about what a fabulous clothing sale it is, some of their friends would be notified on their news feeds that their friend interacted with that story. And this is really significant, and I'm going to throw up an infographic that I found online, which I think is really relevant to this discussion, and it's based on a study done by Burst Media that says that nearly 1 in 4 people in the United States say they would be more likely to buy a brand if their friend liked that brand on a social media platform. That is incredibly powerful, and just think of the implications that this has for these sponsored stories. If people are likely to be swayed by their friends liking your brand, if your friend is engaging actively with your brand, that is incredibly powerful. The other thing about sponsored stories that I found fascinating was that apparently the more your sponsored story gets traction on its own after you put it out there, it spreads organically through the EdgeRank system, and you don't have to pay anymore to spread that story further if it's happening organically. One of the quotes that I wanted to share from the book was that with sponsored stories, Facebook makes it purposely cost inefficient to distribute bad creative. I think that's such a great quote, and it's so true. In most media platforms, whether your creative is good or not has nothing to do with how much you pay, and it has nothing to do with how long it stays out there. But in Facebook, if you put out a sponsored story and it dies quickly on its own, you'd be an idiot to pay for that sponsored story to go out again. Facebook helps you realize whether your creative is bad or good based on the traction that it gets, and then you can decide what to do from there. Next up is Twitter, which you've heard me say many times that I'm a huge fan of, but there were still lots of things that Gary pointed out in this book that really surprised me and that I found fascinating about his analysis of Twitter. And the one thing that I wanted to highlight is trendjacking, which is when you follow the trends that are making an impact and you use those trends to highlight your own brand. So if a TV show has a finale, or if there's a big news event, or some kind of funny meme that's going around, you actively try to incorporate your brand message using those trends. I was obviously aware of trends, and I do try to use those trends when I'm tweeting. I try to make use of trends when they happen. There were certain tactics that I thought were really fascinating, like the idea of using promoted tweets at a time when something is really trending to get your message out there alongside that message. Gary used a really great example of a charity event that had a Go Red hashtag, and Tide promoted a tweet that would show up along with Go Red that was, of course, about its detergent's ability to keep your clothes bright and vibrant. And he pointed out that, you know, it was a missed opportunity for people like Crayola or Target, or people who have a very strong association with red. That really struck home. I thought that was really fascinating. And the other thing was about using really simple trends to throw right hooks. So there are lots of things that trend on Twitter that are phrases that everyone is using that day. So the example that he used was hashtag sometimes you have to. Now this is usually used for humorous context and for people to just make random observations using that hashtag. It's a way for people in the Twitter sphere to feel like they're all part of one large conversation. But if you were a brand, that hashtag sometimes you have to could be used in any context you want. He used a couple of funny examples like hashtag sometimes you have to call a lawyer. But you could use it for anything, like hashtag sometimes you just have to have a midnight snack, or hashtags sometimes you just have to put the roof down, or whatever it is. Whatever brand you are, that hashtag is so easy to incorporate, and that actually didn't really occur to me on that scale before. I always saw those hashtags as completely for irreverent and fun use. And then we have Pinterest. The one thing I wanted to share about Pinterest was the idea of properly naming your boards, so that you're not, even when you're creating product boards for specific products, you're not just naming your boards things like, he used the example of a tea company. So you're not just naming your boards things like green tea, black tea. You're naming your boards things like tea to get you through exams, or tea for dealing with the in-laws, or tea for the end of a very long day, or something like that. And you could use that with a clothing company or a food company. The idea is that even though Pinterest is a virtual storefront in many occasions, it doesn't have to have the same basic utility that an actual store would. You know, you don't have to look at the aisle and go, oh, soup is down that aisle and jeans are down that aisle. You can use the social media platform to be really creative with the way that you name those boards. People are still going to know what the boards do, but they're going to be drawn to those boards by the names and hopefully stay for the great products you highlight. And then we have Instagram, and the one piece of advice I wanted to share from his Instagram chapter is one that I actually learned a little earlier this year, but I'm making more use of now, and that's go crazy with hashtags. I have seen firsthand what a huge difference these hashtags make. And again, I come from more of a Twitter background, so my experience with hashtags is more punchlines and just a couple of hashtags here and there that relate to trending topics and things like that. But I've noticed on Instagram, people will throw 20, 30 hashtags behind something, and I thought that was crazy at first, but it actually seems to really work. So his advice is go crazy with these hashtags, and I think that's definitely something that I would agree with at this point. And we talked about this in class, and we talked about the number of hashtags and number of words per post and things like that. But it's something that in the months since we started, I've really become more convinced of, and this book reiterated. And finally, we finish off with Tumblr, which I admitted at the top of this vlog is not a platform that I'm very familiar with. It was a very short chapter in the book, but I did find some things interesting in it. So the thing I'm going to highlight is that Tumblr doesn't use a social graph. It uses an interest graph, which is very different than what Facebook does. So it makes connections in an entirely different way, which I didn't realize. So Facebook uses their edge rank, and it's all based on who you interact with and who you engage with, and that determines the rankings on your newsfeed. But Tumblr Tumblr uses an interest graph platform that makes connections based on what you're interested in first and foremost. I don't know exactly how it works, but I think that the concept of doing that instead of the social graph is really interesting. So those are the social media platforms that were highlighted in Jab, 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 Right Hook. It was really interesting to see each of them broken down chapter by chapter and to have those very specific examples from each platform highlighted. It was a blast to read, and it was so informative. And as I mentioned at the top of the vlog, I'm linking to my Pinterest board in the description so you can take a look at the real world examples that I found of content that is jabbing and hooking on social media platforms, and my thoughts on whether or not those jabs landed. So thank you for letting me share my thoughts on Jab, 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 Right Hook.